Ramadan is a course correction. Islam operates on multiple levels. Do you believe in a universe of scarcity, of grid time and grid money? So Ramadan forces us to confront that. The Creator exists, the Creator controls, the Creator provides, the Creator blesses. The call of Ayn Rand is the call to be an animal. This is the life that we are sold, and it's a scam. They have found a way to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze people more and more. It's been the slow boiling of a frog.
How do you understand this obsession that many Muslims have with places like Dubai?
It's the most anti-Ramadanian thing in the world, the Dubai model.
We often associate Ramadan with seeking closeness to Allah, to God, which of course is its aim. A believer abstains from food and drink in the daylight hours to commit themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We draw closer to Him through worships and good deeds, and this is a month of charity. Muslims give more in this month than any other time in the year, hoping that our sincerity reaches Allah, and in the process He overlooks our failings. But in many ways, Ramadan stands as a denunciation of capitalism, the insatiable wants, greeds, selfishness and gluttony. It teaches us to focus on what is important: family, ummah, justice, and of course our own salvation. This is the argument of Imam Tom Facchine, who joins us today. Imam Tom Facchine is Research Director at the Yaqeen Institute. Imam Tom, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much.
When the genocide in Gaza began, I vowed we would never let those responsible get away with this. Silence was complicity in a world that wants us to remain placid, a world that wants us to be concerned more about our immediate lives and interests. The system buys our souls in return for acquiescence with their empire-building project. We at the Thinking Muslim set about changing the narrative, and in the process, with Allah's barakah, we galvanize our communities to confront these political elites and send them a clear message. In elections on both sides of the Atlantic, we brought communities together and led the way in countering their pernicious agenda. Such is the power of this new media. Our mission is simple. We want to build an alternative Muslim media, one that is rooted in faith, thinking, and enlightened activism. And we need your help to expand this sacred undertaking. Our plan is to turn the Thinking Muslim into a multi-show, multi-country media project. Please help us by becoming a member. For as little as £10 a month, you will have access to bonus shows, behind-the-scenes content, and Q&A with me and my guests. But most importantly, your contributions will make this voluntary project go to the next level and give you a share, inshallah ta'ala, in this reward. Now, I know the demands on our sadaqah are great. Please do consider becoming a member of the Thinking Muslim, or send us your one-off donations by going to thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us.
Well, Jazakallah khair for joining us. Now, this may sound like a very odd conversation to have, especially at the beginning of Ramadan. Many may not grasp the idea of Ramadan being a challenge to an ideology, to capitalism. Like, just set up that conversation for me. We'll go into the details and the weeds in a bit, but set up that conversation. Why do we claim Islam or Ramadan to be that denunciation or critique of capitalist ideology?
Sure. After Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu Rasulillah. So we have to realize that Islam operates on multiple levels. So as you said in the introduction, that there's a personal, individual, devotional aspect to the worship, but then there's also a structural, societal aspect to worship and the institutions that those acts of worship either require, necessitate, or are facilitated by. So a very, very obvious example would be zakat. Okay, and I know Dr. Suhail Hanif has done a lot of work illustrating this and explicating on this point, that zakat is not simply an individual devotional act of worship. It is also a process of wealth redistribution in the community, which is very important because it tells us that Allah is essentially saying that without that, there's a tendency for wealth to accumulate in certain hands, and it exacerbates inequality in an undue way. So this is very important that we have a balanced understanding. Allah says in the Quran that a certain amount of inequality is by His will. Why? In order to test you who is grateful and who is patient, and in order to give both sides opportunities to accrue virtue, to give the rich the opportunity to accrue virtue through the redistribution of their wealth and giving it away, and the poor to accrue virtue through their patience and their dignity and honor and trust in Allah despite their situation. Okay? Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that we step over all the homeless people and say, go get a job, right? This is also a structural part of the religion where even if you go into the books of fiqh, and some of the Hanafi scholars especially, when they talk about what are the types of wealth that are zakatable, that must be paid zakat on, they speak a lot of the conspicuous wealth that the people in the community see. Because you would imagine that if you're going to the masjid and I'm praying next to somebody who's driving a Lambo and I'm, rumbling along in my Prius or my Corolla, that there might be something of a resentment, or there might be something of a waswas, a suggestion, a satanic suggestion of jealousy. But if I know that this person is paying their fair share in the community, it cuts that resentment. It strengthens that solidarity. Okay, so that's zakat. So fasting, Ramadan has a similar sociological and even civilizational import and significance. That let's imagine a society without Ramadan to see the fruits of Ramadan. That without Ramadan, what is the tendency of people is to fall into a scarcity mindset. That we need to work every hour of the day in order to accumulate a certain amount of income or a certain amount of wealth. And if we don't, we're going to end up in the poorhouse, and we're not going to be able to take care of our family or our responsibilities. And people, Muslims already face these challenges and these suggestions, these satanic suggestions, despite Ramadan, right? Even with the prayer. Oh, well, if you take time out to pray, then that's less studying or less time open business or less time at work. Technically true, but what universe do you believe in? Do you believe in a universe of scarcity, of grid time and grid money, where every dollar or every pound is the same as every other pound, and every second is the same as every other second? Or you do believe in a divinely created universe where Allah can put blessing in some seconds and take blessing away from other seconds? And He can put blessing in some pounds and take blessing away from other pounds, so that these things actually aren't fungible. Literally, they're actually not fungible. They're not the same. So it's a theological challenge as to what type of universe do you believe in? Do you actually demonstrate your belief in the Creator, that He is the provider, that your provision is, and I challenged the audience I was with last night with this, that if aliens came down from outer space and they looked at the Muslims and they watched them how they behave, and then you told them, these people say that they believe that Allah is the provider, do they act like it? What would the aliens answer? Many of us, the aliens would say, no, they don't act like it. They might teach it in their Sunday schools. They might say it in on their mimbars, on the Friday prayers. But they act as if they believe there is no God. They act as if they believe that God doesn't create or provide for them. They act as if their provision was not promised to them. They act as if that Allah didn't say, through sending it to the Prophet ﷺ, that your provision is written by the time that you're in the womb. It's determined. It will come to you no matter what. They don't act like that. So Ramadan forces us to confront that. You have to slow down. You're not going to be as productive. You don't even have the access to the calories. Let's talk about, I used to work on farms. Okay, in addition to I have a ton of very eclectic experiences, right? And it's like, so I used to work in restaurants, both in the kitchen and then as a waiter. And I used to work on farms. If the materialist was right, I should have been enfeebled by my physical labor. I'm depriving myself of calories. I'm depriving myself of sleep. In the summertime, working out in the weather, 12-hour days in the sun, doing physical manual labor. If the materialist is right, I should be suffering. The materialist was wrong. I was thriving because the Creator exists, the Creator controls, the Creator provides, the Creator blesses. And so Ramadan forces you to confront that reality, that you are being sustained by Allah. You are being sustained by the Creator. Your provision is in the hands of the Creator. Whether you take time off or whether you go to work, it doesn't change what's going to come to you whatsoever. That the stores of energy, how much energy you have, in order to complete your tasks, your grades, your whatever, it is already determined by Allah. So you might as well live your life in obedience to Allah, because disobedience is sure not going to profit you. And the only thing that will profit you is obedience. Okay, now that's on the theological element. Then what about the societal element? How do we measure success in our societies? How do we measure success as a family? We say, oh, mashallah, he's a doctor, mashallah. You know, he has so much, he's got a nice house and a nice neighborhood and all these things, and he has to work. That's a problem, or at least it creates a dependency or a potential problem, where now anything that would threaten that livelihood becomes seen as a threat or suspicious, which is why Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, "Ash-shaytanu ya'idukum al-faqra wa ya'murukum bil-fahsha." That it's the devil that threatens you with poverty. Any scarcity mindset is attributed to the devil. The devil threatens you, tries to get inside your head, say, if you don't do X, you're going to end up in the poorhouse. If you take time for prayer, if you, how many times we get the students ask us around Ramadan, it's like, oh, do I have to fast through exams? Yeah, you fast through exams. If I fasted while I was harvesting vegetables, you have to fast through exams. Like, it's normal, right? That we have to be careful that all scarcity mindset comes from the devil and his suggestions. But the two things that Allah promises are in contradistinction to that. Allah promises you bounty and forgiveness from Him. Okay? So when it comes to our families and how we organize our time, and then how we organize our society. The GDP, what is the GDP, this sacred cow that we've put up for ourselves? How do we know? I laugh at all these these indexes come out every couple years about which is the country that lives the most by the Sharia, and it ends up being like Ireland or something like that. And it's like, why? It's the GDP, mashallah, the GDP. It's like, what is the GDP? There was someone who said, the Muslim, he said something about in COVID, it's like, oh, I went to Target today and I bought some stuff, even though I didn't need it. Like, why? Oh, I wanted to stimulate the economy. What? What madness is this? When the companions led austere lives, when the Prophet ﷺ said, "Izhad fid dunya yuhibbukallah," that refrain and abstain from what's on earth and Allah will love you. When the Prophet ﷺ used to sleep on a mattress of reeds and he had them imprinted on his side when he would get up. When the companions, they owned 1 or 2 pairs of clothing. When some of the companions, when they were buried, that the cloth that they had to bury themselves in or shroud themselves in, if you cover the head, the feet come out. If you cover the feet, the head comes out. And this was not all by circumstance. This was their way. When Umar ibn al-Khattab was the Khalifa, when he was the ruler, and he came up to Sham, when Sham had been conquered, and he met one of the companions, and they embraced, and he said, Umar basically said, I want to come with you to your home, and he said, you're not going to like what you see. Because when Umar came in, there's nothing. He owned nothing except his sword, his horse, and his bow. That was the extent of his provisions. And they had just conquered, and he had the ability to build a palace. He had the ability to, that was his concern. So how do we evaluate what society is succeeding or not? I would even say, and I say this with love and respect, some of our Muslim charities fall into this. When we paint the sad picture of this group or this group that we want to help, and we say, oh my goodness, they live such squalid lives. They don't have a schoolhouse. They have a school outdoors. MashaAllah, the best school is outdoors. Yes, education is important. We're not talking about, it's not that, but sometimes the things that we associate, so we have to be careful that we don't assume that the Western scale of measuring success and progress and advancement is imposed upon the world because it's not a self-evidently true scale. Is that what does the GDP have to do with you or me being happy? What does the GDP have to do with blessings? What does the GDP have to do with piety and righteousness? It has nothing. And in fact, radical idea, we could probably stand to reduce the GDP. It'd probably be a good idea. Because if you're only worshiping the GDP and you're only trying to push it up, then what it has led to a society of waste, it has led to a society of pollution, and led to a society of a throwaway society, a society of planned obsolescence, a society where everything is meant to be thrown away and meant to be cast out. We don't mend our clothes anymore. We get rid of them. We don't mend our shoes. We don't mend our cars. We don't fix them, or we get rid of them, get a new one. And our society has started producing things more cheaply to break sooner so that you can just get a new one and throw it in the landfill. We throw it away. Where's away? Away is part of the creation. There's a physical place where the trash goes. And if you were to actually, if this was brought into our consciousness, out of sight, out of mind, if it were brought into our consciousness, we would be ashamed. We would be ashamed of how much refuse that we produce and how much we squander the blessings and the resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. That Allah doesn't love those who waste. He says that in the Quran. And the mudbadhirin ikhwan ash-shayateen, that the people who are wasteful are brethren to the devils. Now, this is something that Ramadan is a course correction. We consume less. Try to consume the same amount of calories in Ramadan that you consume outside. It's very difficult.
Yes.
Usually the first week, you try it because you're used to it. And then you can't sleep and you have horrible indigestion and these sorts of things. Like, you actually can shrink your stomach, just like you can expand your stomach if you just eat with reckless abandon. You can survive off of less. You can get by with less. You can do more with less. And that's part of what Ramadan teaches us.
نشكر مؤسسة بيت المال اللي ساعدت على طلاب غزة إنهم يبدوا في التعليم، وبنشكر على كل حد ساعد في هذا الإشي وخلى كل طالب يتمنى العلم.
واليوم أول يوم كان في المدرسة، واليوم انبسطنا كثير في المدرسة، وشكرا لدعم مدرسة الأمل، وشكرا للمعلمين والمعلمات، وشكرا لكم.
مرحبا، أنا إيناس مراد. حابة أشكر مؤسسة بيت المال على دعمها لمدرسة الأمل. إحنا كثير انحرمنا من الدراسة، قعدنا سنة ونص بالبيت.
Thanks for Baitulmaal to build our school, to give us the hope. Today is the first day in the school, and thanks so much to make us to continue to do new successes.
This is interesting because, of course, very few people will pit Ramadan or place Ramadan as a challenge to capitalism. So let's talk about the different facets of capitalism and how this Ramadan we need to think about challenging those facets in our own lives. Ayn Rand, who's I suppose a high priestess of neoliberalism, she spoke about how selfishness, and being greedy, and sort of the idea that greed is good. These should become moral virtues rather than moral vices. How does Islam, or how do Muslims, or how should Muslims view morality and these moral obligations?
The call of Ayn Rand is the call to be an animal. That's the simple way to put it.
Yeah.
That the only thing that differentiates us from us to the animals is morality.
Yeah.
And living for higher ideals and higher purposes. The idea that greed should be turned into a virtue and that self-interest will somehow balance itself out. It's also very ahistorical. We've seen that. We tried that.
Yes.
We saw, especially in the Western Hemisphere, when this type of thinking was perhaps at its peak and unbridled capitalism was perhaps at its peak, and you had seemingly unlimited access to resources and a seemingly fresh slate for those who came to the United States, and the clear cutting of forests and the complete destruction of lakes that are no longer usable and the complete contamination of the water sources, we saw what unbridled greed and selfishness does. It historically was a failure. So much so that even the American society had to pump the brakes and say, hold on a minute, we actually need to change course. And that's when you have the rise of the national park system and FDR and the New Deal, and people forget that time period because now it's been quite a while, and so they've forgotten the lessons. Now we think deregulation because there have been other problems with the three-letter agencies and the overreach and corruption, and there are other problems with that. But we've also forgotten about the hard-learned lessons and all of the exacerbation of forest fires and the exacerbation of flooding and we lived in the United States a period where cities would be wiped out every 20 or 30 years by major fires or major floods due to the ecological destruction that was wrought by this unbridled capitalism, by this greed, by this self-interest. So it's not even historically true. Look and just study what happened in the places that this was implemented. We've extinguished species. The bison were completely wiped out, or the buffalo were completely wiped out. Many other species were completely suffocated and wiped out. So we've tried it. We don't even have to go to theory. We've tried it, and it was a miserable failure. And so we have to question the thinking here, and we have to say, is this really the rational conclusion that it portends to be or postures as? Or is this merely a justification for a base desire that seeks warrant and a legitimizing discourse? And I think that people they get into Ayn Rand in their teens and their early 20s. I think I hate to be patronizing, but I think that when you live more, and I've read Ayn Rand, especially as a teenager, but when you live more and you see people of various stripes and you see different experiences, you see how limited and small that mentality is and how it kind of makes sense if you squint. But if you take a second to think about it, that it proposes a Hobbesian world of the war of all against all, and everybody having the only limiting factor is force in those situations. In the Randian world, the only limiting factor is force. There is no place where self-interest becomes a mutually beneficial thing, that there is exploitation, that people will resort to exploitation. And what really is at the base of it is that people are led by their desires and they're looking for an intellectual justification to act wickedly on earth. And that's what I believe is at its base.
A former British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was a neoliberal, said, I think, that there's no such thing as society, just an individual and their family. And I suppose the idea was that if everyone works for themselves, then society will improve, if there is such a thing called society. So individualism is in many ways the cornerstone of this capitalist belief system. How can we use Ramadan to question at least this idea of individualism in our lives?
It's a really interesting proposition because it questions us, or it forces us to question what a family is for. And there are sociologists and historians that have written about this, that there used to be the understanding of a family as a corporation. Some call it the corporate family, or the family corporation, that when, let's say when my ancestors came to the United States from Italy, that they all worked as a unit, as a business, almost like as an enterprise. And those who have immigrated more recently, they know this, that the oldest child is usually responsible for getting the good education and bankrolling the educations of the rest, or maybe has to go work to provide. There's all these sorts of decisions that are made at a collective level. Okay, so where's Thatcher's world in 2024? We don't even have that. So we see an erosion and the elimination of society, and then after that was the erosion and the elimination of the family. Now it's everybody is, as Dunn said, a man unto himself, right? He fancies himself a phoenix, right? That they imagine what is the vision of your life that is sold to you, that is communicated to you. Jalal, what do you want to be when you grow up? You. Don't ask your parents. Don't ask about duty. Don't ask about what your siblings' rights upon you are. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be this thing. I'm going to go to school for this, and this is going to be my education, my career, my family, my everything. And so now we march through life, no, we don't march. Actually, we sit on a conveyor belt as individuals. And that is the life that is promised to us, that you can get a mortgage and you can have your house in the suburbs and you can live a comfortable lifestyle, and you're entrapped by debt and you're entrapped by your addictions, and, but you have Netflix, so you're okay. So, quiet down there. Don't, rock the boat. This is the life that we are sold. And it's a scam. I mean, I believe that one of the things about neoliberal society, especially in our era, and I'll speak from the American experience, that they have found a way to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze people more and more. It's been the slow boiling of a frog. Real wages have not increased in America for 50 years, right? They have found services and public goods have been eroded in those 50 years. The debate whether Marx or Foucault was right has been settled. It was Foucault. He was right. The material conditions for a socialist revolution, according to Marx, have already come and gone. But the people have been ideologically conditioned to accept it as normal, and even to pat themselves on the back as we're the most free society in the world. At least we're not like those third worlders, happily smiling as they go to school in their chairs out in the forest. Yeah. So we have to really consider that these are not people who want the best for us, that are positing these so-called realities or truths, that there's a large enrichment or a scam of enrichment of the elite that happens through these processes. It stands to benefit the elite of society, or the ones who hold the strings, to be able to reduce your interdependency. Interdependency is also a collective autonomy, right? When you are an individual, the wolf goes after the lone sheep. When you are individually dependent upon the government and your credit score and this and that, you're held firmly in place, and you have to be very careful, or else you'll fall off that conveyor belt. But when you have a more collective unit, that we are the family corporation, and we're taking care of each other, and God forbid if someone should become a widow, or someone should be get paralyzed, or have something, that we all take care of one another and we move together. If someone's going to move, we're all going to move together. Very, very different way of thinking about life. So Ramadan I believe it puts us in touch with this, that you have to rely on other people more, that you have to have more interdependence. And dependence is a very radical thing these days. We're sold independence, but it's a different type of dependence upon a system, like a state or the government or your economy. But there's a different type of dependence, an interpersonal dependence within Islam, on your spouse, on your elders, on your community, that actually creates the possibility for a different kind of freedom that you can't ever attain moving through life as an individual.
How do you understand this obsession that many Muslims have with places like Dubai? There is a, and often they say when they go to Dubai that it's a destination where you can be a Muslim, right? You can practice your faith openly and freely. Like what I can see from your face,
pain.
You're going to. There's a lot of pain.
Ajah. Yeah. So, what definition of a Muslim are we operating with, that I can be a Muslim in Dubai in a way that I can't be in London or in the U.S. or God forbid, a humble place in the desert or in a forest somewhere? A secularized version of a Muslim, a consumerist, capitalist version of a Muslim, that really what I want is shopping malls, and I want holidays, and I want resorts, and I don't care about the migrants who had to die to build them, and I don't care about where the trash gets thrown away, and I don't care about the externalities of my lifestyle. It's the most anti-Ramadanian thing in the world, the Dubai model. And as you can tell, I am pained, viscerally pained, by Muslims who think that Dubai is a model of success, without even getting into the politics, just getting on to the economics and what it means for society. That this is a deeply held inferiority complex that we have, that we are attempting to recreate the Tower of Babel, or the what we think of as whatever we think that progress and civilization is. Almost like some of the post-colonial literature out there is quite severe, but it actually is very accurate when you say, who's going to drink the alcohol, the most alcohol, and who's going to be the most promiscuous. It will always be the colonized elite, because they have to prove that they belong to the colonizer, right? So they have to outperform, and there's terms for this that I'd rather not say on this program. But that's what Dubai is to me, that we're trying to prove to the West so bad that, look at me, I'm as progressive and as enlightened as you, and I can build and exploit and conquer and destroy and trash just as well as you can. And I think that's horrible.
There is we know that Islam has a long tradition of challenging one's inner vices. Imam Ghazali talks a lot about this. So it's not as if these vices are of greed and arrogance are just byproducts of capitalism. They've been around since human beings have been around. But of course, maybe it's fair to say that capitalism makes these vices a virtue, as we said with Ayn Rand. In particular, arrogance comes to mind. I mean, capitalism tends to make a human being extremely arrogant about themselves and their progress and what they've achieved in life. How can we temper these internal vices, internal traits, and how can we utilize Ramadan to I suppose to find Islamic concepts, Islamic ideals to moderate arrogance and greed and whatever?
Absolutely. Yeah. Ramadan forces us to confront the idea of going without and voluntarily going without, not because you're forced to, not because of your circumstances, but choosing to go without is an extremely important spiritual practice, because it accustoms you to a certain type of patience. It humbles you. You human being that thinks you're so great and thinks you're so arrogant, look at how pathetic you are without your coffee. Look at how pathetic you are without having your morning meal. Yeah. That you're complaining, you got a headache, and you're trudging through the day. Look at how much you depend upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continuously prop you up despite your weakness. That we are continuously and ever dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for everything. And it forces us to confront that.
I'll ask you about the story in Surah Kahf, where we've got the two men and their one was arrogant and one was, I remember sitting for a khutbah once where the Imam explained this story very well, and it really stuck with me. Can you just explain the difference between the two and
Excellent.
What made one stronger in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the other?
One of the dangers of material wealth that is touched upon in the story is that when we are exposed to comfort or to material wealth, we fall prey to delusions of permanence. That is always the test of wealth. And another important story with this is Qarun. This is the story of Qarun in Surah Al-Qasas. So if you've got one person and another person, and each of them have gardens, and the one is taking pride in having more than the other, like I've got more land than you, and I've got more children than you, and I've got more this than you, I've got more that than you. And the humbler person is saying, it's nothing because of what you've done. That's just the bounty of Allah, and Allah can take it away if you want. And the arrogant one makes the crucial mistake that Allah attempts to rectify time and time and time again in the Quran, which is conflating material success in this life with divine approval. And so he says some things, he's like, and I'm not even sure if there's ever going to be a resurrection. So he falls into that delusion of permanence. But he even also says, and if there is, I'm going to get even more. So it's a horrible analogy that he makes, and a mistake, but one that demonstrates the cunning nature of our reason, and the fact that really we instrumentally utilize rationality when we're really looking for license for what our nafs is trying to strive for. And that he thinks that his wealth and bounty in this life is an indication of divine approval, that he's then entitled to even more in the afterlife. And then, of course, it was all destroyed. And the lesson is that, no, it wasn't. That it's a fitna in the literal sense of the word. Just like we said in the previous program, it shows what you're made of. How you act when you're up shows what you're made of. How you act when you're down shows what you're made of. And that is a process of preparation, deposits and investments that you make. If you haven't made the investments and deposits along the way, that is one of the many situations that will expose what you've been saving up or not in that case. And the situation with Qarun in Surah Al-Qasas is even perhaps, well, it's just as relevant. I mean, they ask him, how'd you get all this money? He says, from my knowledge. I deserve it. I studied hard. This is what I deserve. I worked for it. This is literally the words, we had when I was in university. We had a hunger strike and protests because this was part of the neoliberal takeover of higher education in the U.S., where presidents of universities were no longer educators; that they were becoming corporate. They were and business people. And so we had an incoming president who was a former World Bank employee, and the neoliberal model of slashing the costs and upping the profit margin, and that was the only concern. And we've seen how that leaves universities and higher education prey to moneyed interests in the last 15 months. Anyway, so one of the things that they were doing to cut costs was to take all of the cafeteria workers who had a career, that was their job, 40 hours a week with benefits, and make them into temps, make them into part-time so that they wouldn't have to pay them benefits, and it's no longer a career. And so we tried to fight this. We ultimately were unsuccessful, but we did a hunger strike, we did protests, and we were in the office of the president. And the president made over $300,000 a year as a salary. And there was another university where the president had taken a pay cut in order to, this was recession time as well, like in order to keep going the other workers, so that the other workers, we said, why don't you please do the same? And the response we got from her was, I worked hard for this. It was Qarun's response. It's like, this is what I'm entitled to. And Allah knows best what happened with that individual, but they'll meet their justice eventually. But we see that human delusion, humans have such a propensity to delude themselves. The delusion of permanence and the delusion of entitlement. Those, I think, are the two main things. Thinking that we should always have this. Ramadan breaks that. Nope, you don't deserve that whatsoever. You're not entitled to that. You're not entitled to 3 meals a day. You're not entitled to eat whenever you want and drink whenever you want and do these things. You have no right to demand that or expect that. And it forces us to confront that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So far, we've talked about the evils of excessive wealth, or maybe the arrogance that comes out of excessive wealth. But of course, we know that Islam did not, like Marxism, Islam isn't a faith that stops people from accumulating wealth. Mm-hmm. And Islam does not confront even the luxuries that one may possess in one's life, as long as one does that with the right frame of mind. So what is that balance? Can you explain that balance to us? And how should we exercise our natural need for growth, our natural need for wealth, but these excessive qualities that you talk about that are problematic?
It all comes back to what's your ultimate goal and who are you serving?
Yeah.
Right? What is your object of obedience? For many people who accumulate wealth, it's themselves. They are serving themselves through their wealth, either to gain validation from other people or to feel that they have a certain amount of comfort, whatever it is. For other people, they use their wealth to serve Allah. And that is the proper use of wealth. And you see that there was always important, and that's a huge corrective that Islam has for Marxism or other systems that are very sweepingly categorical and black and white, that you can be a righteous, rich person. You can be. There were companions who were righteous, rich people. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Uthman, Abu Bakr, they had money. They made money. Tons of money. But it wasn't stagnant. That's an important thing. And Allah says when He's talking about zakat in the Quran, that one of the ultimate objectives of zakat is so that money will not simply circulate between the wealthy or the elite, that it must move, which is why zakat also is not an income tax. It's a tax on surplus stagnant wealth. If you dip below and then come back up the threshold, then, it resets the clock. That's important. Money is meant to move. And so there is a way of inhabiting that. But as we see with Abu Bakr, as we see with the other companions, they were ready to part with it on a moment's notice. That when the time came to finance a capital gains project or a military expedition or whatever was they put it in service of the Muslim community, and they put it in service of their own salvation. And that's really the ultimate thing. And we have to be careful because, we have to assess where the community's at. And right now, it seems like the community has tilted to the extreme that we justify having wealth without really emphasizing the duty that comes along with that wealth. We say things like, oh, Allah loves to see the sign of his favor upon a believer, and Allah hasn't forbidden the zina, as he says in the Quran, the nice things or the finer things in life. And the Prophet ﷺ said that arrogance is not in having nice clothes, all of which is true. But contextually, if we use this as an excuse and our mosques are underserved and our institutions are underserved and there's poverty in our communities and people aren't paying their fair share, then this is a problem. Then we've gone too far to one side. And if we were ever to go too far to the other side, then we would correct accordingly. But when you see the community leaning one way, when literally there's a place in Canada where a brother had a fancy car and he had a glass wall installed in his house, or no, his garage, so he could look out the window and look at his car. Now, I want you to give me any justification for this religiously. Yeah. There's none. That's israf. That is waste. And I fear for that brother on the day of judgment. So we have to be realistic, but also, yes, like it is not categorical that it is there just like your intellect, just like your network and your connections, just like your skills. It's all there to assist the other Muslims and to worship Allah and to push His deen forward and to serve humanity and society. And as long as it is used for those ends, then it's okay.
One final question for you. Capitalism infects all of us and infects our ways of being and the way we interact with others. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about how capitalism has maybe infected the da'wah scene. It just seems to me that wealth is flowing through sort of this Islamic da'wah scene, and maybe there is a danger. And I'm not saying that one can't be paid for one's services and for the commitment one puts into travel and whatever it may be. But there may be a danger of excessive wealth flow into personalities and just, I don't know if you share that feeling. But,
absolutely. No, I'm very concerned by it. I detest the celebrity dawah culture.
Right.
And what it has done, and the structural problems that it has brought along. Yeah. The fact that we brand ourselves as individual speakers rather than collectives, I think is one front that is very problematic.
Yeah.
So if you brand yourself as an individual, what consequences does that have on your ability to receive critical feedback? If you are employing modern contemporary marketing strategies, then how much is your PR coming in the way of nasiha and rectification and accountability? These are really serious things that we need to talk about. If this is a monetized space or a commodified space, overly so, then how does that shape our relationship between each other? Do we see each other as competitors? If we see each other as competitors, then are there turf wars? Do people get blackballed? Do we not even trust each other enough to confide in each other when we're struggling with something, which all of us do? Every single person does. Right? So there are serious structural consequences, negative consequences to the commodification of dawah. But even perhaps more than that, which is bad enough, what are we spending our money on as a community? That's my bigger concern. Because if we were to do programs that developed capacity within the community, and we were to spend a lot of money, let's say this, like such and such a person comes along or such an organization, and they're going to show us how to develop capacity over here, and we're going to be able to do a lot more for a lot. We're going to be able to open up halfway houses. We're going to be able to have more programs and feed more poor and do all of these things. Yeah. I can justify, that makes sense. What I'm concerned about is that our money seems to be going to talks that just make us feel good. And that's not significant enough of justification for me. Perhaps that's my bias. Maybe I'm just more of a systems person than a whatever, but I think that that's a problem. And I think that we need to consider the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in this, that you will follow the way of those before you into the lizard hole. And we've seen what happens with televangelism and these. What's next? Are we going to have sheikhs in private jets? That would be embarrassing. That would be, and someone will provide a religious justification for it, but I really fear what that might mean. So we have to. I absolutely agree that this is why we had the waqf. We had the waqf to take care of this stuff. Scholars were taken care of by the waqf. Dawah was taken care of by the religious endowments. And there was dignity in that. And there was humility in that. And there was accountability in that. I'm concerned about for-profit dawah. The way that the terrain is, I get it. People need to be compensated for their time away from their families and the sacrifices they make. And it's a lot. I get it. But I don't see it as a long-term setup. I think that we need to move to a waqf-based model that has more connectivity and more mentorship and more collaboration. And that's something that we've challenged ourselves with, whether it's been back when I was with Utica Masjid or elsewhere. Like, how do you treat the other people in that space? Do you collaborate with people that are the small fries? Or do you only look to collaborate with the people above you for clout? Yeah. Right? Do you collaborate with people and put people on and advertise for people who they might call you out once in a while? Yeah. They might publicly disagree with you. Or do we get salty and just sort of nurse our wounds and see that person as a competitor? Right? These are really, really important things that we need to take seriously.
Imam Tom Facchine, thank you so much for your time. Jazakallah khair.
Ameen wa yakum.
When the genocide in Gaza began, I vowed we would never let those responsible get away with this. Silence was complicity in a world that wants us to remain placid, a world that wants us to be concerned more about our immediate lives and interests. The system buys our souls in return for acquiescence with their empire-building project. We at the Thinking Muslim set about changing the narrative, and in the process, with Allah's barakah, we galvanize our communities to confront these political elites and send them a clear message. In elections on both sides of the Atlantic, we brought communities together and led the way in countering their pernicious agenda. Such is the power of this new media. Our mission is simple. We want to build an alternative Muslim media, one that is rooted in faith, thinking, and enlightened activism. And we need your help to expand this sacred undertaking. Our plan is to turn the Thinking Muslim into a multi-show, multi-country media project. Please help us by becoming a member. For as little as £10 a month, you will have access to bonus shows, behind-the-scenes content, and Q&A with me and my guests. But most importantly, your contributions will make this voluntary project go to the next level and give you a share, inshallah ta'ala, in this reward. Now, I know the demands on our sadaqah are great. Please do consider becoming a member of the Thinking Muslim, or send us your one-off donations by going to thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.